welcome Dr. Raymond Federman.
I hope you didn't believe all that. It's pure fiction. He invented me. Before I talk about I think the title of it's The Crisis of the novel, I want to say a word or two about the ABR, the American Book Review. I am really pleased. In fact, I'm honored that ABR has now found a real home. 1977, my good friend Ronald Sukenik and I, the late Ronald Sukenik, who founded the ABR, we were in New York. We had given a reading and we were complaining. And suddenly, the New York Times Book Review stopped reviewing our books, not just mine and Sukenik, the books of that group that was labeled experimental writers, and began to review mostly, as you know, the New York Times book reviews. It's more advertisement for books than it is reviews. So we're sitting there having dinner, and Ron says, I want to start a magazine, a journal where we can review books that everyone is ignoring. And we discussed that, and I came up with it. And let's review America, not just New York. And so we called it the American Book Review. In the beginning, I was involved with it. We both, Ron and I, put money to start this thing, and it struggled. It struggled all over, constantly on the edge of disappearing. But somehow it got into Boulder, Colorado, where Ron Sukenik was teaching. Then it moved to Illinois. Then it moved somewhere else. But finally, I was in the office of ABR today, and I was very impressed. You people, whoever is responsible here, I'm most grateful. Not for me, for ABR. And for Ronald Sukenik, who would be so pleased to see what is happening here. So keep it up. You have something really precious here. It's now an institution. We are celebrating 30 years this year of ABR. It struggled. But it reviewed books that no one paid attention to, and especially poetry. No one reviews poetry. ABR reviews poetry. Each issue has a focus on an interesting topic. So I hope you will continue to support the American Book Review and its editors over here. Crisis in literature. You've noticed that, and I noticed it again the other day. I was in Barnes & Noble. I never go into that supermarket of books, but I was there with my wife. We wanted to buy a book, some kind of book we needed about traveling. And then I noticed there in that corner a little section, nobody ever goes there, called literary fiction. Oh, they have fiction. There's an old wall that says fiction. And then on the other side is an old wall that says nonfiction. And then there's a lot of T-shirts and other thing, and there's piles of books by Stephen King like this, and then Clancy over there, 600 copies. Literary fiction. So I went into that little zone. I found one of my books there, yes. Oh, I found, Dostoevsky's there, and Balzac. They've been shoved aside. Nobody goes to literary fiction. Yeah. What is this distinction that has been made between so-called fiction, I suppose fiction as entertainment, all these books that are lined up there, all these little paperback with embossed covers, waiting to become television sitcom or whatever. They're all dying there, they're waiting, they're begging you with little pictures, holes in the cover, Anyway, and then over there, I call them the fallen prophets. They're all over there. Now, what I want to talk about is how did we get there? How did we manage, not only in this country, that's happening all over the world, how did we manage to separate literature from the rest, from entertainment and so on? So I want to go back a little bit and try to retrace for you what has happened in America that led us to that. After World War II, a number of great novels came out about the great adventure, World War II. Novels, The Naked and the Dead, The Young Lions, From Here to Eternity, and they were great books. They were relating, they were telling us about a certain reality. Some of us did not experience, some of us did. And they were very realistic in their way. They were necessary. Then there were a number of other novels that appeared which began to deal with what America was becoming in the 50s, a very affluent country. Marjorie Morningstar, remember Marjorie Morningstar, the Deer Park, all these big books. William Starren, Lie Down in Darkness. They were literary. The great kings of American literature had died. There was Hemingway and Faulkner. So we're waiting for the next king to show up. You know who the next king was? Who got the Nobel Prize? Saul Bellow. Another great writer. Yeah, who also faded a little bit towards the end, but that's another story. So we were comfortable in reading. We believed these stories. We believed this realistic novel. Until about 1959, where a book appeared, a novel. Two books appeared in 1959. Catch-22 and Naked Lunch by William Burroughs. And suddenly we began to say, oh, maybe all that great adventure and all these great stories these guys were telling us, there was something fishy about it, something absurd. I'm not going to go through the story of Catch-22, but it's really the first novel that points out to the absurdity of war, the absurdity of being in the army, and you know the story of Yossarian, what he does. He doesn't want to fly those planes because you have to be crazy to go up there and drop bomb, but you have to also really crazy not to do it. And so a good American who doesn't fly them, he goes into business. It's all about black marketing, it's about making money. It's a great novel, because it denouncing something. And about the same time, William Burroughs published Naked Lunch, denouncing not the story, but the language, the virus, as he called it, virus that language can be, which we are at the end of the 1950s, not only in America, all over, into a crisis of language. Out of World War II. I was in France during World War II. I was a young man, young kid, and we would listen to the radio, and the radio, of course, was German propaganda. We have killed so many Americans today. There were so many planes I've been doing. They were winning the war. And then in that night we would listen to the British radio or the Free French radio. And they were winning the war. And so who was telling us the truth? Where is the truth? And we were confused. Yes, in Europe, people, the language, the so-called official language, was lying to us. And this is what begins to emerge towards the end of the 1950s. So that a kind of novel began to appear. Oh, I learned today he died. Slaughterhouse-Five, one of the great novels about World War II. Kurt Vonnegut died yesterday at the age of 84. Did you? And now Slaughterhouse-Five here is Vonnegut who says, I was there. I was in Dresden when they dropped those bombs and killed, I don't know how many thousands of people. More than died at Hiroshima, by the way. And I was there. And they never told the story, and so he gets himself into the novel under his own name and rewrites his story. Tells us maybe the truth about what really happened. A number of these novels began to appear in the early 60s, revising history and revising the language, what I call the official language. But it was more tricky than that. 1962, I'm teaching at the University of California in Santa Barbara, finishing my doctorate, and teaching a course in French grammar. Someone opens the door and says, did you hear? They just killed the president. How many of you remember that? November 22nd. It's not true. And so the whole class came out. We went to this big room where they had a television, and they had television, and the whole day we all watched President Kennedy being killed over and over again. Television became a very important element. And across America, this was true in every university, in every corner, people would say, it's not true. It cannot be happening. But it was happening. And 2 years later, it's Robert Kennedy and then Martin Luther King. And suddenly we began, as Americans, to doubt the history that was in the making. To questions, because it was all coming to us through the screen. The television. We call it the screen, and the screen is what? Is what opens up into the world and at the same time falsifies reality. During the first so-called Gulf War, you remember the Gulf War? I wrote a piece for the German radio about it. Did it really happen? Or was it Hollywood that was... We never saw the war. We saw experts that would come there and explain the whole thing. The second one, we are seeing some gruesome images. Maybe not they allow us to see if you... But the first Gulf War, we saw nothing. We were being explained what was happening. I didn't think it happened. In fact, I believe someone wrote, when we, the Americans, landed on the moon, never happened. It was Hollywood who invented that. I'm bringing this example because suddenly our relationship with reality had changed drastically as of 1962. So if you sit down to write a novel, you had to deal with reality in a much different way than you did before. And the novel began to... Now, not everyone wanted to accept this kind of new fiction that denounced things, that changed the way we were dealing with not only reality, but with history. This is also the beginning of the civil rights movement, the women's liberation. This is the beginning of gay liberation. There's all kinds of changes taking place in the real world, and how do you deal with them? A new kind of writing also appeared about this time, which is called the nonfiction fiction. I think that's what the new journalism, Truman Capote, Norman Mailer, The Armies of the Night, Why Are We in Vietnam, In Cold Blood. They were strange books. They dealt with the real, but they were blurring the line between reality and fiction, between the facts, between history and imagination. And a number of novels were written, and they had to be written with a certain irony or humor. They were called black humor. The novels of John Barth, the novel of John Hawkes. I mean, there were a number of novels written in the early 60s that were revising history. Ishmael Reed, one of the great American black writers, wrote a book called Mumbo Jumbo, where he was literally rewriting Uncle Tom's Cabin, but rewritten not from the point of Uncle Tom, from the point of the black man. And he wrote another novel called Flight to Canada. This was during the Vietnam War, where we were being, the young men were being told, love it or leave it. And so many of them flew to Canada or disappeared. At that time, I wrote a novel during the early 70s called Take It or Leave It, which is an army novel. Yes, it's about a kind of denunciation of the absurdity, the stupidity of life in the army. I was then with the 82nd Airborne Division. Would you believe that in 1951, the entire Airborne Division, 82nd Airborne Division, went by truck to northern New York State at a place called Camp Drum to practice parachute jump in the snow in case we had to invade Russia? Yes. That was the reason. Well, I didn't go because I was being sent to Korea, but anyway, it's another story also. So things would be, but then, so television began to play in between us and reality. There was this thing, and we did not have direct contact. Now, if you write a novel, you had to keep that in mind. And then we arrive at 1968. Some of you remember it's a fantastic year, 1968. That's Berkeley. That's the kids over there at Berkeley, burning thing. That's Columbia University. That's May 68 at the Sorbonne in Paris. That's the Russian tank going into Prague in 1968. And that's the French theoretician saying the novel is dead. And others went even further, saying the novelist, the author is dead. So we're at the end. And my good friend Ronald Sukenik published a book in 1968 called Death of the Novel and Other Stories. You guys think we are dead, but wait, we still have a few stories to tell. But wait to see how we're going to tell these stories. And that is, I think, the great change that occurred in American literature, is that the novel, another important event of 1968, the novelist John Barth published an essay in the Atlantic Monthly, very important, a very seminal essay, The Literature of Exhaustion. Some of you know that essay. Literature of Exhaustion is Barth and many of us were saying, we don't trust the novel anymore. As we don't trust history, as we don't trust the making of the history in the making. And so the novel is exhausted, the same old story. That doesn't mean that people stop. There are millions of people who keep writing the same old novel as though they were living in the 18th or 19th century, but these are irrelevant. They don't count anymore. They write the same story over and over again. They just change the name of the character. These novels are just ones that are piled up there in Barnes and Noble. Every 6 months there's another one. And they have to be big because they sell, not by the quality, but by the weight, I think. So a number of us, and we were not young, we were all now a little advanced in age, began to rethink, to reinvent the novel. to reinvent the novel. Well, it's true that in the process we rendered the novel a bit unreadable. That's why we were declared first unreadable and of course unmarketable. Yes, that's about the time when Ronald Sukenik and I decided to start ABR because no one wanted to talk about our books. Oh, they were being taught in universities, doctoral dissertations were written. I don't know how many doctoral dissertations were written about my books, and yet I will sell, 75 copies of the book, and then it would arrive in a bookstore and it will disappear. Something very curious was happening in the beginning of the 70s or middle of the 70s. Well, it could be connected, and it was indeed connected, because in America we are living what we call a sequence of 8 years. Every 8 years we get a new government, a new president. And we move from this side to this side and become more conservative or more liberal, whatever side you take, it changes. Well, during that period, we are in the middle of the Vietnam crisis, we're in the middle of the Watergate crisis. History is going on, and I didn't know, tells us Nixon, I had no idea. Well, okay, I resigned, I quit. This was all, we were in the middle of lies. The official discourse of America was full of lies and falsifications. How do you sit down and write a novel? Well, the first thing you have to do, if you're a serious writer, we have to go after language. We have to purify the language. The very great writer, Donald Bartlemy, I think one of the best of this generation, it's my generation, most of them are dead now, there's only a few of us left. And what I call the last of the Mohican, I think. Refer to that language as the dreck, that all the cliches, all the things, the ready-made sentences that began to appear in the novel. And if you read, I love to do that. I go to the supermarket, and while my wife is shopping, I go next to the tomatoes where they have all these novels, next, and I read just the first page. And it's always the same thing. It is so predictable. I know in advance where this book is going. On the plane, they showed, not seen it, it's a cute movie, The Pursuit of Happiness. It's nice. I even had tears in my eyes, but I know exactly where it was going. I know I was end, That's the kind of novel that you find on that big wall. That's not the kind of novels you find in what is called the literary fiction. So this is what we began to think. How to revise the language? How do you attack? Sometimes we did it by piling up the cliches, in fact, so that the point you couldn't take them. So we were writing novels. My first novel, which was published in 1978, called Double or Nothing, is a novel that questions every aspect of writing a novel. How do you name your characters? Where you start a story? It's a series of questions. In fact, one of the reviewers said that, I like that, it's a manual to teach how one should write a novel. Well, it was in that manual for me because they were teaching me how to write a novel, how to reinvent the language of fiction. In the process, we had to get rid of what are the traditional elements of fiction. And what are they? There are three of them: characters, setting, and plot. Plot, that's for dead people, we declared. So no more plots. No more plot. See, that is to say, you had no beginning, middle, end, and nice little resolution at the end. No, our novels were open at both ends. The setting, well, it doesn't matter where it takes place. There are novels now, and great novels, in particular the novels of Samuel Beckett. You read them, you don't know where you are, it doesn't matter. You can be in a room, you can be somewhere. And the characters, well, the characters were no longer those full-fledged, well-described, where you counted the buttons on their coat. And, the kind of description you get in a 19th century novel when you were in school and you had to read these big novels and you came to Balzac giving you 26 pages of description, you will skip that. But then you will feel guilty because you say, if the professor asked me a question, I want to. So you went back and read. And then you kept looking at the end of the book, how many more pages do I have? And it went on and on like this. I once proposed to a publisher to publish one of my novels without page number. That was a scandal. It came out, take it or leave it, another novel has no page. But then I suggested, why don't we number the pages 250, and then as you read, you go backwards, and then you know how many pages you have left, you don't have to look at the... So, these were things, no, they were called gimmicks. But there were two things we were, and I'm telling for myself, but this is true of those, the writers that I include in what I call our group was Walter Abish, John Barth, Robert Coover, Donald Bartley, me, Ronald Sukernick, Steve Katz, and I can name another. That's the group, my generation. Okay, we were declared, we were called metafictionists, we were called postmodern. I had the postmodern one, that was the beauty of it. No one could define what postmodernism was, but we were postmodern. We were also anti-fictionists, and then I invented the word surfiction. It's a book I published in 1976, a collection of essays by eminent writers who were trying to define what are we doing here? Why do we do this? That was literary fiction. It kept going, but the more it grew, the more it separated from these other fiction writers, if you can call them that. We went on telling us the same story in the same old way. The most important for us was to find there are no new stories to tell. Basically, there's a couple of stories. It's how to tell that new story. Now, there were other things happening which work in relation with us. Sometime after World War II, all the great painters, the great artists met. Let's say they met in Bombay. That's a nice place. And they said, starting tomorrow, we don't show them anything. Remember that moment? What are the subject of painting? Men, women, and nature. And suddenly, mankind and nature disappeared from paintings. Some of you will remember the panic when we went into a gallery and museum. It's easy. Anybody can throw a pot of paint on a canvas. And we've learned now that, yes, there may be fakers, but when you go look at a Jackson Pollock, or Rothko, or Franz Klein, and you feel something. It is beautiful. There's nothing there. I own a number of paintings. I collect friends of mine. And my mother, my great-mother-in-law, a Viennese woman, very proper, would come to my house and, oh, you have a new painting. Oh, isn't that a little chair upside down? No, it's not a chair. It's just paint. She wanted to see. She wanted to put back what the painters are taking out. Now, it's very difficult when you write fiction to take out. You cannot. In a novel by Samuel Beckett, called The Innameable, the character says, if I were only to say blah, 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 blah for the rest of the book, but that would be cheating. And the white canvas is the furthest you could go in abstract painting. There's been some white canvas or black canvas. They're not totally black and white. There's the Great Museum in Buffalo, where I spent many years. There's a painter who is not well known because he refused to sell his painting, Clifford Steele. Any of you are familiar with the work of Clifford Steele? It's fantastic. Yeah, I stood with a French sculptor, his name is Alain Kirilli, who came especially to Buffalo to look at the Clifford Steele. They have a huge, he gave, 30 of his paintings to the Albright Knox Museum. We stood for an hour in front of a black painting, and he pointed out, you see all these nuances, it turns to gray, gets darker. I don't know how many nuances of black he counted, so it's not black, and you can do the same thing with white. But you cannot do that with language. You cannot remove the language completely. But you can go, is what Beckett calls about his own writing, I want to reach the fundamental sounds of language, where language is finally purified of all the garbage, all the dreck of bathing. So this is happening in the 1970s. And more these books are being pushed aside with labels, experimental, postmodern, so they don't reach the public. And it's too bad. Especially when we get to the 1980s. One great writer appears in the 1980s, a great American writer. You get 3 points if you can name him. Raymond Carver, who became very popular. Now, Raymond Carver went back to a kind of realism. There's no experimentation in Carver, but there is, yes, is a man who suffered great angst, great despair, for whatever personal reason. Fantastic books, the stories of Carver. Well, what happened is that thousands of clones of Carver began to start writing, one after another. They were called the Kmart fictioneer. They wrote like Kmart or Walmart, whatever. Yes, imitations, but without what counts in a great novel is when you feel inside that it hurts. It hurts to write that book. And Carver did that. But it's too bad because Carver and the clones took over. And so the kind of work we were doing was relegated. It's resurfacing a little bit thanks to ABR. Anyway, some of these books, for instance, Ronald Sukenik published a very great novel in the 70s called 98.6. 98.6 is, of course, the temperature, but he was taking the temperature of America. And read it, you'll see, if you have never, what was happening at that time. Very intelligent book, I mean, a profound book, and very funny at the same time. Oh, that's the only thing that saved us. And again, my own word, we could only write this book with humor. We could not take it seriously because we know we were dismantling something. And we were dismantling it out of, but all the great novels are funny. All those great novels that are considered anomaly. Tristram Shandy of Lawrence Stern, where they were always sending us there, what you guys are doing, I mean, Lawrence Stern did it before. Or me, as a Frenchman, they were sending me to Diderot. But read these books, they're very funny. The great novels that undermine things are all full of a certain humor. And so from the black humor of the 60s, we move into a different kind of humor. There was big laughter, and you pointed out in your tour that even though I deal with some very traumatic events, my books are funny. They're funny. I'm going to read later today from Return to Manure. Yes, it's a serious book. But I hope if you read it, you'll see it. It's a funny book. I laugh when I write it. And sometimes in fact, it is well known that some of those writers who wrote those very serious books would explode into laughter. Kafka. I imagine Kafka finishing the Metamorphosis and thinking, laughing, wait, Papa, until you see what I wrote tonight. This big bug that appears. Joyce laughed when he was writing. Proust was laughing. And Beckett, I'm sure the day Beckett was writing Waiting for Godot, he invented that word Godot. He laughed. Oh, wait till these guys try to make sense what is. Oh, I know they're going to all say it's God. No, he must have laughed that day. So there we are towards the end. So now I want to read you, because I had prepared this long lecture. I mean, it was a very boring long lecture. Very, very serious about the title. The title alone. It's an essay, in fact, that Jeffrey Eyre is going to publish in a book he's putting together. It's coming out already. And the title was Critic, Fictional Reflection on the Pathetic Condition of the Novel in Our Time. And the first beginning was very serious in this. And then there is a second section which is called The Fall of the Prophet. But I'm not going to read you. I just want to read you a few final pages. Since I am an incurable optimist, besides being an incurable foreigner and an incurable word addict, I will propose that rather than retreating before history, as many writers have done, rather than retreating in the face of the threat that electronic communication presents, that is to say television but mass media, literature must take a stand, even if it is a last stand. We cannot give up. I was asked once, it was in India of all places, on live television by the woman who was interviewing me, Mr. Federman, why do you continue to write novels? Why don't you do something else? Well, I told her I love to play golf all day long, but why don't you make films? And I told her, and I still like my answer, because the novel is perhaps the last place where you can write well. And I don't mean make beautiful sentences. It's the last place where you can be responsible, morally, politically, psychologically, whatever. It's the last place. You read magazines, the language, you read newspaper, the language is terrible. I mean, the way they write. It's always the same sentences. In a recent book entitled Metamorphosis, the French thinker Costas Axelos reflects profoundly on the never-ending end of the world which we seem to have reached. And he writes, I'm translating from the French, it is possible that in this era in which we live demands clandestine thinkers to think the world, to traverse that world and transmit signs appropriate to the rhythm of the time. And we do live in a very strange kind of rhythm. The signs of the past are no longer valid. And it is true that what passes for literature today in many parts of the world seem unable to transmit signs appropriate to the rhythm of our time. the rhythm of change, of transition, of metamorphosis. Most of the books published today no longer concern themselves with reality, but rather with the mellow, dramatized image of reality projected by mass media. Most of these books mimic television in technique as well as in substance. I'm talking about those books lined up on a big long wall there. It is in this sense, I believe, that what passes for literature is simply an insipid second-hand replica of what literature was once upon a time. This is especially true in America, where the media has overtaken culture. But I have a feeling that this is also quickly happening, or will soon happen, in most places in the world where books and television coexist. For most people, television has become the real world, but a world which has only one ideology: commercialized entertainment. Even the reporting of news, that is to say history in the making, must be presented as entertainment. Otherwise it does not pass, which really means it does not sell. As we became acutely aware during the first Gulf War, which was for us in America a mere television spectacle. A war made for television, by television, and presented artistically for consumption as our evening entertainment. The French critic Jean Baudrillard even claimed in his essay that the Gulf War, the first one, never happened, that it was invented by the news media. Television has become the real world, a world of spectacle as the emblematic sign of a commodity form, lifestyle advertising as its popular psychology, banal seriality as the bond which unites the simulacrum of the show to the audience, electronic images as the only form of social cohesion, media politics as ideological formula, the buying and selling of abstracted attention on the marketplace. Cynicism, violence and sexuality are its dominant cultural signs. All these aspects of television culture have invaded what passes for literature today. I mean, you go through that wall and you have the romance novel, the pseudo-science fiction novel, and that's what it's all about. Even all these aspects of culture have invaded what passes for literature. But if literature, I mean true, serious, intelligent literature, even if it's called elitist, and our work was often called elitist, is to survive, it must oppose and even denounce the way television captures the world, the way television presents the world, the way television explains the world. Now, that doesn't mean that literature must negate television. I love television. I watch it all the time, sports mostly. Yes, football, baseball. I've now become a great fan of the San Diego Chargers and the San Diego Padres. Well, before it was the Buffalo Bills, but the Buffalo Bills made me suffer so much. I mean, they lost 4 Super Bowl. I couldn't take it anymore. So I moved to San Diego. Now, television is a very, very important medium. We cannot ignore it. And those who say, well, there are some snobs who say, no, I never watch television. That's not true. Television is still an instrument that opens the world to us, even if the world or reality gets falsified. It's an important. But it cannot dictate how you write your novels. What is important is that television must not replace literature, and especially must not dictate to writers how to write their books. In order to find its place again and play a role in the world, literature must resituate itself in relation to mass media. But not by ignoring or negating television, which is here to stay, but by doing what television cannot do. That is to say, present the world and history without interference from economic and commercial forces. That's those books that are put over there as literary fiction. In order for this to happen, writer must regain confidence in literature and assume again responsibility towards language. Yes, especially towards language. Even if this must be done, as Kostas Axelos suggests, in a clandestine manner, that is to say, outside the mainstream, outside the literary establishment, on the margin of fame and wealth. In this triumphant era of mass communication, literature seems ashamed of what it is and what it is doing, and therefore too often readily submits to social and economic compromises. In a world where books have become mere products of consumption and entertainment, it is difficult, if not impossible, to separate the good books from the bad books, useful books from useless books, books which have a purpose from books that clutter the shelves of bookstores and prevent the readers from reaching for literature. I'm going to describe this. In a big supermarket of books in America, chain store usually located in shopping malls, such as Dalton and Walden Bookstore, Barnes & Noble, which sell more T-shirts, calendars, or Stephen King's paraphernalia than books, I recently observed an interesting phenomenon, and more or less repeating what I told you. In the center of the store are tables piled high. These stores, by the way, in the mall is like corridors. Remember, it's important. There's no door in front. In fact, some of the books, the Stephen King and they sort of overflow into the big piles like this. In the center of the store are tables piled high with huge quantities of blockbusters. Bestseller by authors who every 6 months produce yet another book with the same story, the same plot, changing only the setting and the name of characters. What you may not know is that these big blockbusters, they're not written by one writer. They are team written. Stephen King, Clancy, they are young guys, unknown, who do all the research, who come and then there's someone who types all this. This was already way back where Mishnah worked like this. All those big books of Mishnah were written by teams. So it's not an author, but he gets the money, of course, and he gives a few bucks to the kids down there. These are novels which are quickly transformed into second-rate television shows or Hollywood movies. I need not mention the name of these authors. They are well known to us, not for their talent, but for being very rich, receiving millions of dollars in advance for their next prediction. I always say, look, suppose instead of giving Stephen King $3 million, give him 2 and give the other $1 million to ABR or to us. That's what I suggest. Then I observed that on one side of the store, the entire wall is covered with book design as nonfiction. What this means is that here one finds mostly how-to-do books. Books that tell the reader how to improve their sex life, how to lose weight, how to become rich fast, how to buy cheap, how to repair cars, how to keep in shape, how to play better golf or tennis, and so on. Or else one finds along that wall the fat, unauthorized, controversial, obscene biographies of celebrities. That is to say, the rich and the famous. You experienced that, right? Along the opposite wall are shelves full of books designed as fiction. Most of these are pocketbook editions with sexy gold embossed covers, romances, mystery, adventure novels, spy novel, naive science fiction, horror stories, soap operas, which are waiting there, already packaged, waiting and hoping to become television show. I'm repeating myself, but you see where I'm getting. Then there is another wall. Not the one over there, but way at the end of the store, usually the shortest one, because most of these bookstores are like narrow corridors with an open entrance, and at one end so that people can wander in and out and be seduced by the merchandise lined on the shelves and on the table. On that wall, way back there, the far wall at the end of the store, one should almost say at the bottom of the store, there is one shelf with a sign above it says, literature. You won't believe this. In many of the stores I visited, it said that in Gothic letters. Yes, in Gothic letters. Yes, in this bookstore there is still a small place reserved for literature, and in that space one finds hardcover edition of novels by Melville, Faulkner, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Balzac, Flaubert, Joyce, Kafka, and even a few contemporary writers such as Saul Bellow, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Claude Simon, Samuel Beckett, usually those writers whose work have been authenticated by the Nobel Prize, and therefore recuperated into mainstream commercialization. Oh yes, also on those shelves that one finds books of poetry, but where hardly anyone buys these except perhaps the poets themselves. Yeah. The problem, however, with this section of the bookstore is that it is located so far from the entrance, and there are so many obstacles, books and enticing objects obstructing the shelf where literature waits to be noticed, that the potential reader rarely manages to reach that wall, except for a few fanatics of literature who still remember where the section of the fallen prophets is located. It is even more complicated than that. The great problem with literature today is the problem of space. First, it begins with the newspaper that review books. New York Times Book Review. The publisher of one of those, forget the name, blockbuster calls, we are coming out with a new book by what's his name. We're going to run an ad, a full-page ad, or we'll run it for 2 weeks. You know how much it used to cost? I don't know, but we inquire when. How much a full-page ad in the New York Times would cost? $50,000. That page could have had at least reviewed 2 other books. No, but it's not just one page, he says. So the New York Review book has become that, an advertisement for the big publishers. And the books reviewed in the New York Times are the one that the Chicago papers and San Francisco and San Diego and I don't know, Victoria, that's the books that are going to be reviewed. So that a great many books never get reviewed. On top of that, the New York Times will review only books that are outbound. They will not review paperbacks anymore. And poetry, forget it. Maybe once they review. So this is why we need ABR. Then the books come out and they go to the bookstore. Now the bookstore has space, but still limited space. When 600 copies of what's his name arrive, and there is 1 copy of Federman over there on the shelf that's been there for 3 weeks and nobody has looked at it, Federman moves out, is sent back to the publisher, and the space is occupied. It's all a question of occupying space. And that's why this little corner over there, well, they still give it a little space, but I'm sure that very soon in Barnes & Noble, the literary fiction will also disappear unless we do something about it. But let's leave those supermarket of books and return to our topic, literature in crisis, or rather literature in danger of extinction. It is quantity and not quality these days that marks the success of a book. That Michael Korda, editor-in-chief at Simon & Schuster, and I was on a panel with him not long ago, one of the big commercial publishers in America, I was there defending some other small press, should be quoted recently in the New York Times book review as saying, "We sell books, others sell shoes, what's the difference?" Wow, what's the difference? It's not surprising from someone who in fact works for Gulf Western Oil, which has been, Simon & Schuster was bought by Western Gulf. That is the real problem with literature today. It can no longer make a difference. It can no longer be differentiated from objects of consumption. Books are now packaged, presented, promoted, marketed like any other products advertised on television. Beer, soap, toilet paper, deodorant, cars, shoes, and so without any regard for literary excellence. Not all books, but you know which one are being advertised. What's the difference, we are told? I am, or at least I try to be a writer, I try to perceive literature today in its failings, its gaps, its disadvantages, its obscure symptoms, as it faces the conflicts, the fears, the demands, the uneasiness of this new world of ours. But one must look far and attentively to find books in this changing landscape that can still be called literature, in the sense that novels by Balzac, Flaubert, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Proust, Joyce, Kafka, and closer to us, the late Beckett, or Italo Calvino. None of you read Calvino. The last, for me, the last of the great literature. Were called literature, and I still call it, books that respect language, books that work with language in order to capture history rather than merely use or abuse language as a functional tool to present simplistic and simplified second-hand images of reality. I live in a world where most of us who write for something other than fame and wealth, I wish I could become famous and rich, or for something other than personal distraction, have stopped reflecting on the purpose of writing. I mean explicitly in the writing itself, and consequently fail to mark the difference that literature makes in the world. Perhaps it is because literature, and especially the novel, has forgotten how to reflect on its own raison d'être, that is to say, on what it is and what it does, that it can be pronounced dead. And maybe it is dead, but I won't give up. A couple more pages, be patient with me. Nonetheless, the question remains, How can the writer be part of the world? How can the writer function in this world while writing this world in a way that question can be stated more directly? How, as a writer, can I be of my time? How can I be a contemporary writer who lives in history and writes history? Soon literature will have to explain, even to itself, its place and its role if it wants to survive and be more than just what I call a supplement of culture. Those books there, the little fiction, have now become a supplement of culture. They're not part of the culture. There's a little side of culture. A vague souvenir of other times and other places. Literature will be able to explain itself, as I suggested earlier, only when it resituates itself in relation to mass media, and by doing what the mass media cannot do, because by necessity, mass media must compromise itself to social and economic forces. For most people, even those of us who traveled in the world, what has happened to our planet in the last few decades of the past century appears almost incomprehensible. The fragmentation of the Soviet Union into a commonwealth of republics, the disappearance of the wall, and with it the reunification of the two Germanys, the rise of religious fanaticism in many parts of the world, the quick making of unmaking of political ideology, the oscillation of democracies from naive liberalism to stifling conservatism, and much more. If all this history in the making seems confusing and unreal, it is perhaps because it has come to us via television. History has become a set of easily manipulated images that are selected, arranged, packaged, made accessible, simplified, even beautified, and then explained to us by people who claim to be experts. Meanwhile, the writer has deserted his post as witness of history to seek other rewards. In 1947, the French writer, philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre opened his famous essay, Qu'est-ce que la littérature? What is literature? With this sentence: all writers of bourgeois origin have known the temptation of irresponsibility. For more than a century, this temptation has been the norm in literary career. And he wrote that in 1947, and I think it's still true today. What Sartre said then is still true today, whether from the East or the West. All writers are of bourgeois origin, and all writers have known the temptation of irresponsibility, especially when facing the demise of literature. But since the 19th century, since the rise of the bourgeoisie, literature has been in a crisis. Literature has been the site of a crisis, and this crisis reflects the constant transformation that takes place in the world. Or to put it differently, this crisis of literature is the world, the anguish, the desire, the dream of those who live in the world, and which the writer captures in his writing. Therefore, when literature ceases to represent, to be, to accept this crisis, it becomes entertainment. In a rapidly changing world, one should be able to say, here are the books I need, and here are the books that are in my way. Having made that choice, I can also decide as a writer, here is the book I must write because it is urgent that it be written, and here is the book I will not write because no one needs it. Thank you. You may agree or disagree. If you have questions, I'll be glad to answer beside the question.
Sure. Questions you don't want to keep it too long?
I think you said it all.
I said it all. It's not a hopeless situation.
It's interesting, though, in the next American Book Review, just by coincidence, the introduction to it that I wrote talks about the situation about these Barnes and Nobles, and the situation is that these big companies who publish the books are choosing not to advertise in the New York Times Book Review or other book reviews. Rather, they're purchasing big piles of books at these big chains. That's their book review. The book review is this pile of books. I forgot that you were doing that, and it creates a big crisis for the book reviewing. The result of it is that the newspapers around the country are dropping their Sunday book reviews. Like the LA Times was the most recent one, and there are fewer. I think there are only 5 left in the United States. And these are gems. Like I grew up with the Philadelphia Inquirer, a Sunday book review, and I'd read it, I'd enjoy it. But because the advertising space generates, the cost to print it and to purchase reviewers, they're saying, well, why don't I just get a big pile of books?
I want to add something. I was criticizing mostly the situation in America. It's happening all over. In France, there's now called a FNAC, and there were bookstores where you would go, and there are still a few left. There are none of these in America, where you go in and the libraire, the bookstore, knew every book. He could tell you. You go to Barnes & Noble and you have these young girls, high school, whatever, have no idea what they're selling. They have no idea of the book. They haven't read a book. They don't know what a book is. And that's what I call the pathetic side. They could be selling shoes instead of books. It'd be, as I say, it's the same thing. And I miss that, going into a bookstore and having a nice conversation with the man who owns the store. There are a few left. There's one in San Diego. Mostly they sell used books. I don't know, there must be one. Where you can really there and say, oh, I got a new book that you would be interested, because he knows the book. I'm sure it's the same thing if you go buy wine. Right? If the man knows his wine, he will sell you a good bottle of wine. But I don't want to compare wine, but wine and books, they go together.